Sometimes the things we run from our whole lives are exactly what we need to find our way back home. Sometimes it takes losing everything to discover what was always meant to be ours. For $10, Rook bought a forgotten cabin in the Tennessee hills. The place was falling apart, boarded up and abandoned. People said Johnny Cash had been there once, but nobody knew for sure. Eva didn't care about legends. She was 62, alone, and her sister's death had left her with nowhere else to turn. She arrived with a rucksack and 40 years of silence she'd carried like stones. Then she opened the first locked room. Inside were letters, old tapes, and a secret that tied her to the man in black in ways she never expected. What had been hidden there all those years, waiting for her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive from the auction house to the cabin took Eva Rook 3 hours through winding Tennessee back roads she half remembered from a lifetime ago. The truck she'd borrowed from a neighbor back in Virginia rattled over every pothole, and the suspension complained on curves that cut through dense forest and opened occasionally to reveal distant blue mountains. She kept the windows down despite the October chill, needing the rush of air to keep her thoughts from circling back to the funeral, to Lorraine's closed casket, to the lawyer's office where she'd learned about the cabin. Eva was 62 years old, though most people guessed she was older. Her hair had gone silver early, pulled back in a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades. Her hands were strong and weathered from years of work. Carpentry, gardening, whatever kept her busy and alone in the small mountain town where she'd lived for the past 4 decades. She wore a long wool coat the color of charcoal, sturdy boots, and jeans that had seen better days. Everything she owned fit in the rucksack on the passenger seat and a canvas duffel in the truck bed. She hadn't spoken to her sister in 18 years. Not since their mother's funeral, where they'd stood on opposite sides of the grave and exchanged nothing but cold nods. Before that, silence stretched back even further. Decades of Christmas cards left unanswered, birthday calls ignored, a sisterhood that had died long before Lorraine's heart gave out at 65. The lawyer had been apologetic when he'd tracked Eva down. "Your sister left very specific instructions," he'd said, sliding papers across his desk. "The cabin goes to you. She purchased it at auction 15 years ago, paid cash, kept up the property taxes, never lived there herself, as far as I can tell. Just made sure it was maintained." Eva had stared at the deed, at the address that meant nothing to her, at her sister's signature on the transfer documents. Why? She didn't say. But she left you this. He'd handed her a small envelope, sealed with wax. Inside, a single sentence, in Lorraine's careful handwriting. "You'll understand when you get there." The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that branched off from a county route marked only by a rusted mailbox. The driveway, if you could call it that, was overgrown with weeds that scraped the truck's undercarriage. Eva shifted into low gear and crept forward, branches scratching at the windows. The forest pressed close on both sides, oak and hickory and pine, their leaves beginning to turn with the season. Then the trees opened up, and there it was. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure built from logs that had weathered to grey. The roof sagged in places, and several windows were boarded over with plywood that had warped from years of rain. The front porch listed to one side, its railing broken. Ivy crawled up the chimney and wound through gaps in the foundation. A metal storage shed stood off to the left, its door hanging open on broken hinges. Eva cut the engine and sat for a long moment, studying the place. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the lawyer had assured her someone had been keeping an eye on it. Minimal maintenance, just enough to keep it from collapsing entirely. She could see evidence of that. Newer boards, patching sections of the roof, fresh caulking around the intact windows, a relatively clear path to the front door. She grabbed her rucksack and stepped out of the truck. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, of autumn settling into the mountains. Somewhere a crow called, harsh and lonely. Eva walked slowly toward the cabin, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. The front door was locked, but the key the lawyer had given her fit smoothly. The lock turned with a solid click, and the door swung inward on hinges that barely squeaked. Someone had oiled them recently. Inside, the cabin was dim and cool. Eva found a light switch and flipped it, surprised when overhead fixtures flickered to life. The electricity worked. The main room was large and open, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Furniture sat covered in white sheets, a couch, chairs, a dining table. Dust covered everything in a fine layer. But beneath it, the place looked oddly cared for. No signs of animals or water damage. No smell of rot or mildew. Eva walked through slowly, taking inventory. The kitchen was small but functional, with an old propane stove and a deep porcelain sink. She turned the tap and water coughed out, brown at first, then running clear. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, where she found 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with ancient fixtures that somehow still worked. Back downstairs, she noticed a door she'd missed initially, tucked under the staircase. It was warped, the wood swollen from humidity, and it wouldn't budge when she tried the handle. Locked, maybe, or just stuck. She made a mental note to deal with it later. As the sun began to set, Eva carried in her duffel and set about making the place habitable for the night. She found sheets and blankets in an upstairs closet, all wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture. The propane heater worked, filling the main room with warmth. She ate a cold supper from supplies she'd brought, bread, cheese, an apple, and washed it down with water from the tap. Sitting on the covered couch as darkness fell outside, Eva pulled out the only photograph she'd brought with her. It was small, faded, tucked in her wallet where she rarely looked at it. The laminated backstage pass from the Grand Ole Opry, dated April 1983. Her name printed clearly, Eva Rook, performer. She'd been 22 years old, standing on the edge of everything she'd ever wanted. She'd kept it hidden for 40 years, this small piece of evidence that she'd once been someone else. Someone with dreams and a voice, and a future that stretched bright before her. She stared at it now, trying to remember the woman who'd worn it clipped to her shirt, who'd walked those backstage corridors with her heart pounding and her guitar in her hands. That woman had walked onto the stage that night and never came back. Eva tucked the pass back into her wallet and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she'd figure out what Lorraine had wanted her to find here. Tomorrow she'd deal with the locked door and the questions that had followed her down these mountain roads. Tonight, she just needed to rest in this strange place her sister had left her, this cabin that felt both foreign and somehow, impossibly, like the echo of something she'd forgotten. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the boarded windows. Eva pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and listened to the sounds of the Tennessee night, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come easily. Eva woke with the dawn, her body stiff from sleeping upright on the couch. Grey light filtered through the gaps in the boarded windows, painting everything in shades of shadow. She stood and stretched, working out the kinks in her back and shoulders, then set about making coffee on the propane stove. The morning was cold and clear. Eva spent the first few hours doing what she did best, assessing what needed fixing. The cabin had good bones, but it needed work. Broken boards on the porch, gaps in the chinking between logs, that sagging section of roof. She made a list in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, prioritizing what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. By mid-morning, she'd cleared debris from the porch and found a toolbox in the shed, rusty but serviceable. She was examining the broken railing when she remembered the door under the stairs. It had bothered her all night, that stuck door, like an itch she couldn't scratch. She went back inside and studied it in the daylight. The wood had swollen badly, warped by years of humidity. The handle was old iron, the kind that didn't turn but simply lifted a latch. Eva braced herself and pulled hard. Nothing. She tried pushing instead, throwing her weight against it. Still nothing. There had to be a trick to it. She ran her hand along the frame, feeling for the source of the resistance. The top corner had warped outward, jamming against the frame. She went back to the shed and found a pry bar, then carefully worked it into the gap, applying steady pressure. The wood groaned. She pushed harder, and with a sudden crack, the door popped free and swung inward. The room beyond was small, barely 8 feet square. A single window had been boarded from the inside, leaving the space in near darkness. Eva pulled her phone from her pocket and used its flashlight to see. The room was almost empty. Almost. In the center, sitting alone on the bare wooden floor, was an old steamer trunk. Eva stepped inside slowly, her light sweeping the corners. Nothing else. No furniture, no boxes, just this trunk sitting like it had been placed there deliberately. Waiting. She knelt beside it. The trunk was made of metal and wood, covered in travel stickers that had faded to ghosts of color. A heavy padlock held it closed, the kind that would need a key or bolt cutters. But it was the label that made Eva's breath catch in her throat. Taped to the top, protected by layers of clear packing tape that had yellowed with age, was a piece of paper. Written in careful block letters, "Forever Rook, when you're ready." Her hands began to shake. She sat back on her heels, staring at those words, her sister's handwriting. She was certain of it, though she hadn't seen Lorraine's writing in decades. Still, she knew it the way you know the shape of your own face. How had Lorraine known she'd come here? The lawyer said her sister had bought this place 15 years ago, long before she'd gotten sick, long before there was any reason to think Eva would inherit it. Had Lorraine planned this all along? Had she been waiting for Eva to show up? Eva tried the padlock, but it held firm. She tugged at it uselessly, then sat back and just looked at the trunk. What was inside? What could her sister possibly have left that needed this much secrecy, this much deliberate hiding? The memory came unbidden. The last time she'd seen Lorraine, 18 years ago, standing across their mother's grave. Lorraine had looked older than her years even then, worn down by something Eva hadn't wanted to acknowledge. When the service ended, Lorraine had approached her. "We need to talk," she'd said quietly. "There's nothing to talk about," Eva had replied, already turning away. "It's about what happened in Nashville, about that night." Eva had frozen, her whole body going rigid. "Don't. You need to know the truth about—" I said don't. Eva had walked away without looking back, ignoring Lorraine calling her name. She'd driven 6 hours straight back to Virginia and never answered her sister's calls again. Now, kneeling in this dusty room, Eva understood with awful clarity. Lorraine had been trying to tell her something important enough to buy a cabin, to hide this trunk, to orchestrate this entire situation so that Eva would have no choice but to find it. She had to get the trunk open. Eva went back to the shed, searching more carefully this time. Tools hung on pegboards, some rusted beyond use, others surprisingly well maintained. She found a hacksaw with a relatively new blade, a hammer, a chisel. She gathered them all and carried them back inside. The padlock was old but solid. Eva tried the hacksaw first, working the blade against the metal shackle. It was slow, tedious work. Her hands cramped. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the cool air. But gradually, the blade bit deeper, metal filings gathering on the floor. It took nearly an hour. When the shackle finally gave way with a sharp snap, Eva sat back and caught her breath. Her shoulders ached. But the trunk was unlocked now. All she had to do was lift the lid. She hesitated, her hand on the latch. Once she opened it, there would be no going back. Whatever Lorraine had hidden here, whatever truth she'd been trying to share 18 years ago, it would be real. Undeniable. Eva thought about her sister's last letter, the cryptic sentence that had brought her here. You'll understand when you get there. Lorraine had always been the brave one, the one who faced things head-on while Eva ran and hid. Maybe it was time to stop running. She lifted the lid. The trunk was packed full. On top lay a sealed envelope, thick with pages, addressed to her in Lorraine's handwriting. Beneath it, she could see the edges of reel-to-reel tapes, dozens of them, each in its own box with dates written on the spines. 1982, 1983. The years before, Eva had disappeared from music, from Nashville, from her own life. She lifted out the envelope with trembling hands, then began removing the tape boxes, stacking them carefully on the floor. There were at least 30, maybe more. All labeled, all dated, all from those 2 years that Eva had spent decades trying to forget. At the bottom of the trunk, tucked beneath the tapes, were more papers. Documents in plastic sleeves, photographs, a leather-bound book that looked like a journal. Eva sat surrounded by it all, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was it. This was what Lorraine had protected, had hidden, had waited for Eva to find. The contents of this trunk held answers to questions Eva had refused to ask for 40 years. She picked up the envelope addressed to her and turned it over in her hands. The seal was intact. Whatever her sister had written, no one else had read it. This message was meant only for her. The afternoon light was fading. Eva gathered up the envelope and one of the tape boxes, the earliest one, dated April 1982, and carried them back to the main room. She'd need better light to read, and she'd seen an old reel-to-reel player in the corner by the fireplace, covered with a sheet. If it still worked, if she could get it running, she could listen to whatever was on these tapes. But first, she needed to read what Lorraine had written. She needed to understand why her sister had gone to all this trouble, why she'd kept this secret for so many years, why she'd made sure Eva would be the one to find it. Eva sat on the couch, her sister's letter in her lap, and stared at it for a long moment. Then, with hands that still shook, she broke the seal and began to read. The letter began simply. Dear Eva, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry for that. Sorry I couldn't tell you this in person. Couldn't make you listen when I tried all those years ago. But maybe this is better. Maybe you need to hear it this way, in your own time, without me standing there watching you react. Eva's throat tightened, but she kept reading. I bought this cabin 15 years ago, at a county auction. Nobody else bid on it. Too remote, too run down, too much work for anyone to want it. But the moment I saw the address, I knew I had to have it. You don't remember this place, Eva. You've blocked it out, along with everything else from those years. But we were here before. Both of us. A long time ago. Eva looked up from the letter, her eyes scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time. They'd been here before? She had no memory of this cabin, none at all. How was that possible? She forced herself to continue reading. This cabin belonged to Uncle Ray, Mum's brother. You remember him, don't you? Or have you forgotten him too? He was a session musician in Nashville back in the 70s and early 80s. Guitar, mostly, but he could play just about anything. Mum used to send us here for a few weeks every summer when we were kids. You were probably 7 or 8 when we started coming. I was 11. A fragment of memory stirred, vague, uncertain. A man with calloused fingers showing her how to hold a guitar. The smell of coffee and cigarette smoke. But the image was hazy, like something seen through frosted glass. We loved it here, Lorraine's letter continued. You especially. Uncle Ray taught us both to play, but you took to it like you'd been born with a guitar in your hands. You'd sit on the porch for hours, practicing chords until your fingers bled. I was good, but you were something else. Even then, even as a kid, you had something special. Eva stood abruptly, the letter clutched in her hand. She walked to the shed with purpose now, no longer just looking for tools but searching for proof. She pulled open drawers and cabinets, pushing aside rusted nails and coils of wire, until in the bottom of an old toolbox she found it. A photograph, faded and water-stained, but still recognizable. 2 young girls standing in front of this very cabin. The older one, Lorraine, had her arm around the younger one's shoulders. Both were grinning at the camera, their hair wind-blown and wild. The younger girl held a guitar that was almost too big for her. Eva's knees went weak. She sat down hard on an upturned bucket, staring at the photograph. That was her. That little girl with the huge smile and the oversized guitar was her. And this cabin, this place she'd felt no connection to yesterday, had been part of her childhood. How had she forgotten? How had she buried this so deep that even seeing the cabin hadn't triggered any memory? She went back inside and picked up the letter again, her hand steadier now but her heart racing. Uncle Ray died in 1981, right before your 20th birthday. The cabin passed to some distant cousin who didn't want it. It sat empty for years until the county finally seized it for back taxes. By the time I found out it was being auctioned, I was already living in North Carolina, and you'd been gone from Nashville for nearly 3 decades. I bought it because it was ours, Eva. Because this is where we learned to make music together. Because this is where it all started, before everything went wrong. Eva set the letter down and closed her eyes, trying to pull up more memories. They came in fragments now, disconnected pieces, sitting on a porch step with Lorraine, both of them singing harmony, the smell of wood smoke from the fireplace, a man's deep laugh, Uncle Ray. I need you to listen to the tapes, Lorraine's letter went on. All of them. I know you won't want to. I know you've spent 40 years trying to forget you ever sang, ever made music, ever stepped foot in Nashville. But you need to hear them because they're proof of what you were, what you could have been, what should have been. Eva opened her eyes and looked at the stack of tape boxes she'd left by the door to the small room. 30 or more recordings from 1982 and 1983. The years she'd spent in Nashville, the years she'd tried her hardest to erase from her memory. There's more in the trunk, the letter continued. Documents, photographs, things I've kept safe all these years because I knew you'd need them someday. I thought I'd be here when you finally came back, when you were ready to face what happened. But life doesn't always work out the way we plan. Eva's vision blurred with tears. She wiped them away angrily. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. maybe decades. Crying was for people who let themselves feel things, and Eva had learned long ago that feeling was too dangerous. The most important thing is this: what happened in Nashville wasn't your fault. None of it. And the choices I made afterward, the way I handled everything, I did what I thought was right at the time. I was trying to protect you. But maybe I protected you too much. Maybe I made it too easy for you to run away and never look back. Eva stood and walked to the corner where she'd seen the old reel-to-reel player. She pulled off the sheet, revealing a dusty but intact machine. It was a professional model, the kind that would have cost serious money back in the day. The reels were empty, but the mechanism looked sound. She spent the next hour cleaning it, checking connections, finding an outlet that worked. The cabin's electricity was spotty, but functional. When she finally plugged the machine in and hit the power switch, lights flickered to life on the display panel. It worked. Eva went back to the small room and retrieved the earliest tape, the one marked April 1982. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she threaded it onto the machine, following muscle memory she didn't know she still had. How many times had she done this before, loading tapes, queuing up recordings? The knowledge was there in her fingers, even if her conscious mind couldn't remember. She pressed play. Static crackled from the speakers, then cleared. And then her own voice filled the room, young and strong and achingly hopeful. She was singing a song she didn't remember writing, didn't remember recording, but it was unmistakably her voice, backed by guitar and bass and the gentle brush of drums. The lyrics were about mountains and leaving home and the price of chasing dreams. Eva sank onto the couch, unable to look away from the slowly turning reels. That was her. 22 years old, in a Nashville recording studio, singing her heart out. The technical quality was professional, the performance confident. This wasn't some amateur demo. This was the real thing. The song ended. There was a pause, and then voices. A producer's instructions, the band preparing for another take, and her own voice, laughing at something someone said. She sounded happy. She sounded like someone who believed in herself. Eva pressed stop and sat in the sudden silence. Her chest felt tight, like she couldn't get enough air. She'd spent 40 years telling herself she'd walked away from music because she wasn't good enough, because she'd realized she didn't have what it took to make it in Nashville. But that voice on the tape, that performance, that was someone with real talent. That was someone who could have made it. So what had really happened? What had driven her away from this, from all of it? She picked up Lorraine's letter again and read the final paragraph. Listen to all the tapes, Eva. Read the documents. Look at the photographs. Then you'll understand why I did what I did, why I kept this place and these things safe for you. And maybe if I'm lucky, you'll forgive me for not being able to make you face it sooner. You've got a voice that matters, little sister. You always did. Don't let him take that from you forever. With love always, Lorraine. Don't let him take that from you forever. Him. Who was him? Eva stood and walked to the trunk, pulling out the stack of plastic-sleeved documents. She flipped through them quickly, looking for anything that might explain what Lorraine meant. Concert flyers, contract drafts, letters from record labels. And then she found it, a photograph that made her blood run cold. She was standing on a stage, young and bright-eyed, wearing the same outfit she'd worn for her Grand Ole Opry performance. But she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his smile wide for the camera. He was older, maybe 40, with silver-streaked hair and expensive clothes. She knew that face, even after 40 years. She knew it. Marcus Drummond, producer, power broker, the man who'd promised to make her a star, the man she'd been running from ever since, ever stared at the photograph until her eyes burned. Marcus Drummond. The name alone made her stomach turn. She set the photo down carefully, face down, and forced herself to breathe. She picked up Lorraine's letter again, reading it more slowly this time, looking for clues she'd missed. Don't let him take that from you forever. Her sister had known. Of course she'd known. Lorraine had been there, hadn't she? In Nashville during those final days, but the memories were still locked away, still refusing to surface completely. Eva returned to the trunk and pulled out the sealed envelope she'd set aside earlier. It was thicker than Lorraine's letter, the paper yellowed with age. Her name was written on the front in her sister's handwriting. Read this when you're ready to know everything. She wasn't ready. She knew she wasn't ready, but she broke the seal anyway. Inside were multiple pages, all in Lorraine's careful script. The first page was dated December 2007, 15 years ago, right around when Lorraine had bought the cabin. Eva, I'm writing this down because I need you to understand why I made the choices I did, why I kept these things hidden for so long, why I bought this cabin and filled it with evidence you've spent decades trying to forget. Eva settled back on the couch, the pages trembling slightly in her hands. After what happened in April 1983, you disappeared. You left Nashville in the middle of the night, didn't tell anyone where you were going. Not me, not the label, not even the friends you'd made there. You just vanished. It took me 3 weeks to find you, and when I did, you were holed up in that cabin in Virginia. The one you eventually bought. You wouldn't talk about what happened. Wouldn't let me say his name. You just kept saying you were done, that you were never going back. Eva closed her eyes, and for the first time, a real memory surfaced. Not a fragment, but something solid. She could see herself in that rented Virginia cabin, 22 years old and shaking. Lorraine standing in the doorway with tears streaming down her face. I tried to convince you to press charges, Lorraine's letter continued. I had evidence. I had witnesses. But you refused. You said it would destroy you worse than he already had. You said no one would believe you anyway, that he was too powerful, too connected. And maybe you were right. Maybe in 1983, that's exactly what would have happened. Eva's hands clenched on the pages. She still couldn't remember what happened, not clearly, but her body remembered. The tight feeling in her chest, the nausea, the overwhelming need to run and hide. Those were the echoes of trauma she'd never fully processed. So I made a choice, Lorraine wrote. I went back to Nashville without you. I gathered everything I could, your recordings, your contracts, the police report you let me file before you changed your mind about pursuing it. I collected statements from people who saw what happened. I documented everything. And then I hid it all. Police report. Eva's breath caught. There had been a police report, which meant something official had happened, something bad enough that the police were involved. I hid it because you needed time, the letter went on. You needed space to heal, to rebuild yourself into someone who could survive. I knew that if I kept pushing you to confront it, I'd lose you completely. So I stepped back. I gave you room. And I waited for the day when you'd be ready to face it. Eva set down the pages and went to the trunk again. She dug through the remaining documents until she found what she was looking for. A manila folder, official-looking, with a police department seal on the front. Her hands shook as she opened it. The report was dated April 18th, 1983. Incident: sexual assault. Location: Grand Ole Opry backstage area. Victim: Eva Rook, age 22. Suspect: Marcus Drummond, age 41. The words blurred together. Eva forced herself to read the details, the clinical language describing what had happened to her. The report stated that she'd performed that night, that Drummond had cornered her in a dressing room afterward, that Lorraine and a security guard had interrupted, that Eva had been taken to a hospital for examination. She had no memory of any of it. Or rather, she had carefully, deliberately suppressed every memory of it. But reading it now, 40 years later, pieces began clicking into place. The way she'd avoided any situation where she might be alone with men, the panic attacks she'd had in her 30s whenever she heard country music, the complete inability to sing, even alone, even in the shower. She'd told herself it was choice, that she'd simply lost interest in music. But it had never been a choice. It had been survival. She read the rest of the report. It noted that she'd initially agreed to press charges, but had withdrawn her statement 2 days later. The case was closed due to lack of victim cooperation. Eva set the folder down and picked up Lorraine's letter again. "I know you withdrew the charges," her sister had written. "His lawyers got to you. They threatened to destroy your reputation, to make sure you never worked in music again. They had money and power and connections, and you were just a scared 22-year-old from the mountains who nobody had heard of yet. So you took the easy way out. You ran. The easy way out." The words stung, even though Eva knew they were true. She had run. She'd spent 40 years running. "But here's what you don't know," Lorraine continued. "After you left, someone else found out what happened. Someone who had the power to do something about it. Someone who gave a damn about you and your music and what you could have become." Eva's pulse quickened. She turned the page. "Johnny Cash found out what Drummond did to you." Eva dropped the letter. It fluttered to the floor, pages scattering. Johnny Cash, the man in black himself. How had he found out? Why had he cared? She scrambled to gather the pages, getting them back in order, reading faster now. He heard about it through his connections at the Opry. He'd been there that night, watching from backstage, because someone had told him about this young singer from Virginia who was supposed to be something special. He saw you perform. Then he heard what happened after. Eva stood and paced the room, unable to sit still. Johnny Cash had been there, had seen her sing, had known what happened to her. "He tracked me down," Lorraine wrote. "Called me directly, said he wanted to help. At first I didn't believe it was really him. But it was. He said he'd seen too many young artists get chewed up and destroyed by people like Drummond. He wanted to do something about it." Eva found herself at the window, staring out at the darkening forest. The sun was setting, painting the trees in shades of orange and gold. "He brought you here," the letter continued, "to this cabin, Uncle Ray's old place, though Ray had been dead for 2 years by then, and the cabin was sitting empty. Cash knew about it through Ray. They'd played together sometimes back in the day. He thought it would be a good place for you to hide and heal. Somewhere away from Nashville, away from the press, away from Drummond and his lawyers. A memory surfaced, strong and clear this time. A black car pulling up outside a Virginia motel. A tall man in dark clothes, his voice low and kind. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." Eva pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. She remembered. She remembered Johnny Cash helping her into his car, driving her through the night, bringing her here to this cabin. She remembered him sitting with her on this very porch, not saying much, just being present while she shook and cried, and tried to understand what her life had become. He set up recording sessions here, Lorraine's letter explained. Brought in musicians he trusted, people who wouldn't talk to the press. He wanted to record your album, the one you'd been working on before everything fell apart. He said your voice was too important to lose, that Drummond couldn't be allowed to silence you. Eva went back to the tape boxes and started pulling them out, looking at the dates. April 1982. Those were her Nashville sessions, before everything happened. But May 1983, June 1983, July 1983, those were after. Those were the recordings Cash had helped her make here in this cabin. She loaded the May 1983 tape onto the player and pressed play. Her voice came through the speakers, older somehow, more haunted, but still strong. And then another voice joined hers in harmony, unmistakable and rich. Johnny Cash. They were singing together, a duet she'd completely forgotten. The song was about survival, about finding strength after everything tried to break you. Eva sank to her knees, listening. She could hear it all now, not just the music, but the compassion in Cash's voice, the way he'd tried to help her find her way back to herself through song. The recording ended, and there was conversation on the tape. Cash's voice. That was beautiful, Eva. You've got something real here, something that matters. Her own voice, small and uncertain. I don't know if I can do this anymore. Yes, you can. I know it feels impossible right now, but you can. You've got more strength than you realize. A long pause. Then her voice again. What if I'm not strong enough? Then we'll work on it together. One day at a time, one song at a time, until you remember who you are. The tape ended. Eva sat on the floor surrounded by evidence of a past she'd buried so deep she'd convinced herself it never existed. Johnny Cash had tried to save her, to help her reclaim her voice and her future. And she'd run away from him too. She picked up the final page of Lorraine's letter. You left before the album was finished. Just disappeared one night. Left a note saying you couldn't do it. Cash was heartbroken. So was I. But I understood. You weren't ready. Maybe you'd never be ready. So I took all the tapes, all the evidence, everything Cash had helped create, and I kept it safe. I kept this cabin safe. I kept your voice safe. Because someday, I thought, you'd be ready to listen. Someday, you'd want to know the truth about who you were and what you could have been. I hope that someday is now, Eva. I hope you can forgive yourself for running. And I hope you can finally understand that what happened wasn't your fault. You were attacked, you survived. And the voice you had then, you still have it now. Don't waste the rest of your life running from it. Love, Lorraine. Eva folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. Outside, full darkness had fallen. Inside, the only light came from the lamp beside the couch and the soft glow of the reel-to-reel player. She had a choice to make. She could pack up her things, walk away from this cabin and these memories, go back to Virginia and the safe, small life she'd built there. Or she could stay. She could listen to the rest of the tapes. She could face what happened 40 years ago and finally stop running. Eva looked around the cabin, at the covered furniture, the dusty shelves, the stone fireplace that hadn't held a fire in years. This place had been her sanctuary, once, her hiding place, her chance at redemption. Johnny Cash had given that to her. Lorraine had preserved it. The least she could do was stay long enough to understand what they'd tried to give her. She stood, wiped her eyes, and loaded another tape onto the player. Then she settled back on the couch to listen to the voice of the woman she used to be, singing songs she'd forgotten she'd written, accompanied by a man who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. Eva spent the next day doing something she hadn't done in 40 years, listening to herself sing. She worked her way through the tapes chronologically, starting with the Nashville sessions from 1982. Those recordings showed a younger version of herself, eager and hopeful, working with session musicians to bring her songs to life. The production quality was professional, the arrangements tight. These weren't demos. These were master recordings, meant for an album that never got released. She found the contract tucked between 2 tape boxes while organizing them on the floor. At first, she thought it was just another piece of paper, another document among many. Then she saw the letterhead, RCA Records, and below it, her signature. Eva held the contract up to the light, studying it as if it might be a forgery. But it was real, dated March 15th, 1983. A 3-album deal with a $20,000 advance, rights to her masters, creative control over her material. For a newcomer in 1983, this was an extraordinary contract. She had no memory of signing it. None whatsoever. Her hands trembled as she read through the terms. The contract had been negotiated by someone named Harold Westin, attorney at law. She didn't recognize the name. The deal included studio time, production budget, marketing support, everything a new artist needed to launch a career. This contract was signed 3 weeks before the attack, 3 weeks before her world fell apart, which meant she'd been on the verge of real success when Drummond destroyed everything. Eva set the contract aside and pressed her palms against her eyes. How much had she lost? How much of her life had been stolen from her that night? She forced herself to keep listening to the tapes. The sessions from May and June 1983 were different from the earlier ones. Her voice carried a weight it hadn't had before, a darkness that made the songs more powerful, but also more painful to hear. Johnny Cash appeared on several tracks, his presence subtle but supportive. He never overshadowed her. He simply filled the spaces, adding harmony or a guitar line, helping her find her way through songs that clearly hurt to sing. On one tape, she heard them talking between takes. "How are you holding up?" Cash asked. "I don't know," her younger self replied. "Some days I think I'm okay. Then something happens, a noise, a smell, anything, and I'm right back there. That's how trauma works. It doesn't follow a straight line." "Did you ever?" A long pause. "Did something like this ever happen to you?" "Not like this. But I've had my share of dark times. Times when I couldn't see a way forward. Music saved me. Maybe it'll save you too. What if it doesn't? What if I can't ever sing again without thinking about him? Then we make music that's bigger than him, bigger than what he did. We make something so true and powerful that it drowns out everything else." Eva stopped the tape. She couldn't listen anymore. Not right now. The emotions were too raw, too present. She needed air. She walked outside, letting the cool mountain breeze clear her head. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. She walked to the shed, thinking she'd do some work, focus on something physical and immediate. That's when she heard the truck coming up the drive. Eva tensed. She hadn't seen another person since arriving. The cabin was remote enough that casual visitors were unlikely. She watched as an old Ford pickup appeared through the trees, moving slowly over the rough gravel road. The truck stopped near her borrowed vehicle. An elderly man climbed out, 75 or 80, with weather-beaten skin and sharp blue eyes. He wore work clothes and a cap with a local feed store logo. "Afternoon," he called out. "Name's Vernon Shaw. I live about 2 miles down the mountain." Eva nodded, but didn't approach. Eva Rook. I know who you are. Vernon smiled, but it wasn't threatening. Well, I know who you used to be. I was the caretaker for this place back in the 80s. Your sister hired me again about 15 years ago to keep an eye on it. So this was the person who'd maintained the cabin, who'd kept it from falling apart completely. Thank you for that, Eva said carefully. It would be in much worse shape without you. Vernon walked closer, moving with the careful deliberation of the age. Your sister was a good woman. Paid me fair and never missed a payment. I was sorry to hear she passed. Did she tell you why she wanted the cabin maintained? Not in so many words, but I figured it out. Vernon studied her for a moment. You were here before, back in 83. You and your sister both. You looked pretty shaken up then. Eva felt her chest tighten. I don't remember that. Well, you were here. Stayed for a few months that summer. Had some musicians coming and going, recording equipment being hauled in and out. I helped with some of it. Moving heavy stuff, running errands into town. He paused. There was a man with you. Tall fellow, always in black. Had a voice like thunder. Johnny Cash, Eva said quietly. That's right. Didn't realize who he was at first. I was never much for country music. But my wife recognized him when I described him. He treated you real gentle-like. Protective. Like you were someone precious who'd been hurt. Eva looked away, fighting tears. I left suddenly. Do you remember that? I do. One morning you were just gone. Your sister stayed another week, packing things up. She was crying the whole time. I asked if you were okay, and she said you would be, eventually. That you just needed time. She kept all my recordings, all the evidence of what happened. Vernon nodded slowly. That sounds like something she'd do. Your sister believed in second chances, in waiting for the right time. He gestured toward the cabin. You planning to stay? I don't know yet. Well, if you need help with repairs, my grandson's a contractor. Does good work, fair prices. And if you need anything else, supplies, directions, someone to talk to, you know where to find me now. Thank you, Eva said, and meant it. Vernon started back toward his truck, then turned. You know, I remember one more thing about that summer. You and that Cash fellow. You recorded something together. A duet. I was outside the cabin one evening, and I could hear it through the windows. Most beautiful thing I ever heard. Made my wife cry when I described it to her later. He smiled. I hope you find what you're looking for here, Ms. Rook. I really do. He drove away, leaving Eva standing alone in the clearing. She watched until his truck disappeared into the trees, then walked slowly back to the cabin. Inside, she returned to the tapes. She worked through June and into July 1983, hearing herself grow stronger with each session. Cash's voice appeared less frequently in the later recordings. She was finding her own footing again, remembering how to trust her instincts. Then she found a tape from late July, one of the last ones in the chronological sequence. She loaded it onto the player, expecting another song. Instead, she heard herself and Cash talking, really talking, in a way she hadn't heard on the other tapes. I think I need to go, her younger self said. I can't stay here anymore. Where will you go? Cash's voice was gentle, not judgmental. I don't know. Somewhere far away. Somewhere I can start over completely. You can start over here. We can finish the album, get it released, show Drummond that he didn't win. But he did win, John. He took everything from me. My career, my confidence, my ability to walk into a room without fear. He won. Only if you let him. Only if you walk away now. A long silence on the tape. Then her voice again, breaking, "I'm not strong enough to fight him. I'm not strong enough to face what happened. I just want to forget. I just want to disappear." I understand that. I do. But disappearing won't make the pain go away. It'll just mean you carry it alone. I've been alone my whole life. I can handle it. You don't have to be alone. Lorraine's here. I'm here. You've got people who care about you. For how long? Eventually everyone leaves. Everyone gets tired of dealing with broken people. The tape ended there, cut off mid-conversation. Eva sat staring at the machine, understanding now why she'd left. She'd convinced herself that leaving was the only way to survive, that staying meant confronting pain she wasn't ready to face. She'd been wrong. Leaving had just meant carrying the pain everywhere she went, locked inside, never healing, never moving forward. She'd wasted 40 years running from something that was always going to catch up with her eventually. Outside, the sun was setting again. Another day gone. Another day spent in the past. But this time, Eva didn't feel like she was drowning in it. This time, the memories felt like something she could hold and examine, and maybe, finally, let go of. She went to the trunk and pulled out more papers. She found photographs from the recording sessions. Johnny Cash and various musicians gathered around her, all of them focused on helping her create something beautiful. She found letters from Cash to Lorraine, checking on Eva's welfare after she disappeared. She found a journal in Lorraine's handwriting, documenting her sister's efforts to keep track of her, to protect the evidence, to wait for the day when Eva might be ready to face it. And at the very bottom of the trunk, she found something that made her catch her breath, a photograph of herself and an older man, both holding guitars. His face wasn't turned away this time. She could see him clearly. Johnny Cash, looking at her with something like pride in his eyes. And she was smiling, really smiling, the first genuine smile she'd seen in any of these photos. On the back, in Cash's handwriting, Eva Rook, a voice that matters. Don't forget it. Eva held the photograph to her chest and let herself cry. Really cry, for the first time in decades. For everything she'd lost. For the woman she used to be. For her sister who'd kept the faith when Eva couldn't. For Johnny Cash, who'd tried to save her and probably blamed himself when she ran. She cried until she had nothing left. Then she dried her eyes, set the photograph carefully on the mantel, and loaded another tape onto the player. She still had more of the story to hear, and she was finally ready to listen. Eva found the set list the next morning while organizing the books on a dusty shelf near the fireplace. It was tucked inside an old Bible, marked with a ribbon, as if someone had been using it as a bookmark. When she opened to that page, the piece of paper fell out and drifted to the floor. She picked it up and immediately recognized what it was. A handwritten performance schedule. At the top, in bold letters, JRC Johnny R. Cash. The set list included 12 songs, mostly Cash standards, but 3 of them were marked differently, with a small star next to each title. Mountain Girl, When the Thunder Rolls, and No More Running. Next to each starred song, in Cash's distinctive handwriting, were the initials ER Originals. Her songs. Johnny Cash had performed her songs. Eva sank into the armchair, studying the set list more carefully. There were notes in the high margins, comments about tempo and arrangement. Next to Mountain Girl, Cash had written, Powerful. Truth in this one. For When the Thunder Rolls, she's got something real. And beside No More Running, this will be the one that makes her a star. She had no memory of writing any of these songs. The titles meant nothing to her. But according to this set list, they'd been good enough for Johnny Cash to consider performing them himself. Eva returned to the trunk and started digging through the remaining tapes more systematically, looking for these specific songs. She found them on a reel dated June 20th, 1983. Her hands shook slightly as she loaded the tape. Her voice came through the speakers, and she heard herself singing "Mountain Girl" for the first time in 40 years. The lyrics flooded back as she listened. It was about growing up poor in Appalachia, about the strength of women who made do with nothing, about the price of leaving home to chase dreams. The song was raw and honest, full of specific details that could only come from lived experience. When the Thunder Rolls was darker, more metaphorical. It used a summer storm as a backdrop for talking about trauma and survival. Eva closed her eyes and listened to herself sing about lightning that leaves scars, about learning to stand in the rain instead of running from it. "No More Running" was the last one. And as she listened, she understood why Cash thought it would make her a star. The song was universal, about facing the things that frighten us, about standing our ground, about refusing to let fear define us. It wasn't specifically about her assault, but the emotion behind it clearly drew from that experience. When the songs ended, the tape continued. There were voices between tracks. "Those are remarkable, Eva." That was Cash, his voice warm with approval. "Truly remarkable. You've taken your pain and turned it into something that will help other people. That's what great art does." "I don't know if it's great." Her younger self sounded uncertain, vulnerable. "It is. Trust me on this. I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between good and great. These songs are great. But who's going to want to hear them? Who's going to want to listen to some mountain girl sing about being broken? Everyone who's ever been broken. Everyone who's ever had to find their way back. That's more people than you realize." There was a pause, then her voice again. "John, what happened to me? I keep thinking about it. I can't make it stop. Tell me." He cornered me in the dressing room, said he wanted to discuss my future, talk about my career. I believed him. I was so stupid. You weren't stupid. He was predatory. There's a difference. Her voice broke. When he grabbed me, I froze. I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I just froze. That's a normal response to trauma. Your body was trying to protect you. But Lorraine said I should have fought. She said if I'd fought harder, if I'd screamed louder, Lorraine was wrong. Cash's voice was firm now, protective. What he did wasn't your fault. You understand me? Not your fault. You didn't ask for it. You didn't deserve it. And the fact that you froze doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. The police said, without more evidence, without me being willing to testify in court. I know what the police said. And I know what his lawyers said. But that doesn't make any of it your fault. The tape cut off abruptly, mid-conversation. Eva sat in the sudden silence, her heart pounding. She remembered now. Not everything, but enough. The dressing room, Drummond's hands on her. The way her body had simply shut down, unable to fight or flee. The shame she'd felt afterward, the certainty that she'd somehow brought it on herself. And Johnny Cash had told her it wasn't her fault, had sat with her in this cabin, recording songs about survival, trying to help her understand that she was still valuable, still talented, still worthy despite what had been done to her. She'd left anyway, walked away from him and from Lorraine, and from her music, convinced that she was too damaged to be saved. Eva stood and walked outside. She needed air, needed to move, needed to process what she was learning about herself. She walked the perimeter of the property, following an old path that led into the woods. The forest was thick here, oak and maple starting to turn autumn colors. Leaves crunched under her boots. As she walked, fragments of memory continued to surface. She remembered Lorraine crying, begging her to stay. Remembered Cash's sad, understanding eyes as she told him she was leaving. Remembered packing her things in the middle of the night, unable to face anyone, unable to explain why she couldn't stay and finish what they'd started. She'd hurt them both by leaving. That knowledge sat heavy in her chest. When she returned to the cabin, she found Vernon's truck in the clearing. The old man was standing on the porch, examining the broken railing. "Hope you don't mind," he called out when he saw her. "Thought I'd take a look at what needs fixing. My grandson can start work next week if you want." "I haven't decided if I'm staying yet," Eva said, though even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. She was staying. She had to stay. There was too much left to understand. Vernon nodded. "Well, the offer stands either way. This place deserves to be taken care of." He paused. "You find what you were looking for? In all those boxes and papers? I'm finding a lot more than I expected. That's usually how it works." Vernon came down off the porch. "My wife wanted me to invite you to dinner tomorrow night, if you're free. Nothing fancy, just pot roast and potatoes. She says you look like you could use a home-cooked meal." Eva almost refused. Habit told her to stay isolated, to avoid connection. But something in Vernon's kind eyes made her reconsider. "That would be nice. Thank you. 6 o'clock. I'll draw you a map." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and sketched out directions. "And if you need anything before then, you call. My number's on there too." After Vernon left, Eva went back inside and loaded the next tape. This one was from late July 1983, one of the last recordings before she disappeared. It opened with just her voice and a guitar, no other musicians, no production, raw and intimate. She was singing a song she didn't remember, a ballad about leaving and loss. The lyrics talked about running away from the people who love you, about the weight of shame, about not knowing how to accept help, even when it's offered freely. It was about her, about what she was planning to do. The song ended, and there was a long silence on the tape. Then Cash's voice. "You wrote that today, didn't you?" "Yes." "You're thinking about leaving." "I have to." "No, you don't. You're choosing to." "Same thing." "It's not. And you know it's not." A pause. "Eva, I can't make you stay. Nobody can. But I need you to understand something. If you leave now, if you run away from this, you'll be running for the rest of your life. The pain doesn't go away just because you change locations. It follows you. Then I'll deal with it somewhere else. Somewhere I don't have to face people who know what happened. Somewhere I can be anonymous. Is that really what you want? To spend your life hiding?" "Yes." Her voice was firm. "That's exactly what I want." Another long silence. Then Cash. "All right. I won't try to stop you. But I need you to promise me something." "What?" "That you'll keep singing, even if it's just for yourself, even if nobody else ever hears it. Don't let him take that from you completely. Your voice matters, Eva. Don't let him silence it forever." "I'll try. And if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to finish what we started here, you know where to find me. The tapes will be here. The songs will be here. It'll all be waiting for when you're ready." The tape ended. Eva sat with her face in her hands, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd thrown away. Johnny Cash hadn't just tried to save her career. He'd tried to save her from herself, and she'd rejected that salvation because she'd been too afraid, too ashamed, too convinced that she didn't deserve to be saved. She spent the rest of the afternoon going through the remaining documents in the trunk. She found a letter from Cash to Lorraine, dated 1984. I've lost track of Eva. Do you know where she is? Is she safe? I think about her often. Wonder if she's still making music. Tell her if you see her that the offer still stands. Tell her I still believe in her voice. And tell her what happened wasn't her fault. She needs to hear that, as many times as it takes for her to believe it. Eva folded the letter carefully and added it to the growing pile of evidence about her past. Evidence of kindness she'd rejected. Evidence of belief she'd refused to accept. Evidence of a life she could have had if only she'd been brave enough to stay. As the sun set again, she sat on the porch with her old guitar, the one Lorraine had kept maintained all these years. She tuned it carefully, muscle memory guiding her fingers. Then she played a few chords, testing her voice. It was rough at first, scratchy from decades of disuse. But it was still there. The voice Johnny Cash had believed in, the voice Lorraine had preserved, the voice Eva had spent 40 years trying to silence. She sang Mountain Girl from memory, the lyrics coming back as naturally as breathing. Her voice grew stronger with each verse, more confident, more like the woman she used to be. When she finished, she sat in the gathering darkness and cried. But this time the tears felt different, not like grief or shame or regret, like release, like the beginning of something new. Eva woke early the next morning with purpose. She'd spent most of the night unable to sleep, her mind turning over everything she'd learned. Now, in the grey light of dawn, she knew what she needed to do. She had to see everything, all of it. No more avoiding the hardest truths. She returned to the trunk and pulled out the manila folder she'd glanced at before, the one with the police department seal. This time, she didn't just skim it. She read every word. The report was thorough and clinical. Incident date, April 18th, 1983. Location, Grand Ole Opry House, backstage dressing room. Responding officers had been called by venue security after Lorraine Rook and a security guard named Thomas Hill interrupted an assault in progress. Eva read the details mechanically, forcing herself not to look away. Marcus Drummond had cornered her after her performance. He was a powerful producer, his name attached to multiple platinum records, his connections reaching deep into Nashville's music establishment. He'd promised to make her a star. All she had to do was be reasonable about what that required. When she'd tried to leave the dressing room, he'd blocked the door. The report documented bruises on her arms where he'd grabbed her, marks on her neck. She'd given a statement at the hospital, describing what happened in halting, broken sentences. But 2 days later, she'd withdrawn everything. Eva found the second document, a letter from Drummond's attorney, addressed to her at a Nashville address she barely remembered. The language was polite, but unmistakable in its threat. Any false accusations against Mr. Drummond will be met with swift legal action. Mr. Drummond has a reputation to protect and the resources to do so. We strongly advise Miss Rook to reconsider her statements before permanent damage is done to both parties. She'd been 22 years old, alone, and terrified. Of course she'd recanted. Of course she'd run. But there was more in the folder, much more. Behind the police report, she found newspaper clippings. Not from 1983. These were more recent. The oldest was from 1995, a small item about a young singer named Jennifer Hobbs, who'd accused Drummond of assault. The case had been settled out of court. Terms undisclosed. Another clipping from 2001. A backup singer named Sheila Morrison had filed a complaint. Dropped 3 weeks later. No charges filed. Eva kept reading. 2004. Rachel Kim, session vocalist. 2009, Amanda Pierce, songwriter. 2012, Destiny Wallace, aspiring country star. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Drummond had continued for decades, and every single case followed the same trajectory. Accusation, legal pressure, settlement or withdrawal. Silence. At the bottom of the folder, Eva found something that made her hands shake with rage. A document marked Confidential Settlement Agreement, dated June 2019. The victim's name was redacted, but the details were there. Assault backstage at a music festival, injuries documented, settlement paid in exchange for non-disclosure. 4 years ago. This had happened 4 years ago. While Eva had been hiding in Virginia, convincing herself that walking away had been the right choice, Drummond had been destroying other women's lives and careers. Her silence had enabled this. Her fear had allowed him to continue. Eva set the documents down carefully and stood, her legs unsteady. She walked outside into the cool morning air, breathing deeply, trying to control the fury rising in her chest. She'd told herself for 40 years that leaving was about self-preservation, about protecting herself from further trauma. But the truth was uglier than that. She'd been protecting Drummond. By staying silent, by refusing to testify, by withdrawing her statement, she'd helped him escape consequences, and he'd used that escape to hurt more women. The knowledge was almost unbearable. She went back inside and pulled out her phone. She had no service here. The cabin was too remote, but she took photographs of every document. The police report, the clippings, the settlement agreement. All of it. Then she found what she'd been looking for near the bottom of the trunk. A letter from Johnny Cash. This one addressed to her, but never sent. The envelope was marked, "Forever, when she's ready." Eva opened it with trembling fingers. "Dear Eva," it began in Cash's distinctive handwriting. "I don't know where you are right now. Lorraine says you're safe, but won't tell me more than that. I respect your need for distance and healing, but I need you to know some things. What Marcus Drummond did to you is a crime, not a misunderstanding, not a mistake. A crime. He used his power and position to assault you, and then he used his money and connections to make sure there were no consequences. This is not your fault. I need you to understand that deep in your bones. I've been asking around Nashville about Drummond since you left. Quietly, through people I trust. And I've learned things that make me sick. You weren't the first, Eva. There are rumors about other women, other incidents that never went public. He's been doing this for years, and he gets away with it because people like him always do. Because he's powerful, because he's connected, because the industry protects its own. I wanted to do something about it. I talked to lawyers, to police, to journalists. But without your testimony, without your willingness to go public, there's nothing that can be done. The system protects men like Drummond. It always has. So I'm not asking you to come forward. I know what that would cost you, and I won't ask you to pay that price. But I need you to know that what he did matters. Your story matters. And if you ever decide you want to speak about it, I'll stand with you. So will Lorraine. You won't be alone. Until then, I hope you're healing. I hope you're finding peace, wherever you are. I hope you're still making music, even if it's just for yourself, because your voice is too important to lose. Don't let him take that from you forever. With respect and friendship, John. The letter was dated March 1984, almost a year after she'd left the cabin. Cash had written it, but never sent it, because he didn't know where she'd gone. She'd disappeared so completely that even people who cared about her couldn't find her. Eva read the letter 3 more times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. She needed to carry it with her, to remember that someone had believed her, had been willing to fight for her, even when she couldn't fight for herself. She spent the rest of the morning going through every remaining document in the trunk. She found photographs of herself with other musicians, women and men who'd worked on her recordings, who'd been part of the Nashville community that had tried to support her. She found contracts and correspondence, evidence of the career that should have been hers. And she found Lorraine's journal. It was leather-bound, filled with her sister's neat handwriting. The first entry was dated May 1983. Eva's been at the cabin for 2 weeks now. She barely speaks. Johnny Cash brought in a doctor who specialized in trauma, but Eva refused to see her. She just sits on the porch, staring at the mountains. I don't know how to help her. I don't know if she'll ever be okay again. Eva turned pages, reading her sister's account of that summer. Lorraine had documented everything: the recording sessions, Cash's patients, Eva's slow progress toward healing. She'd also documented her own frustration. Eva says she's going to withdraw the police report. She says Drummond's lawyers are too powerful, that fighting will just destroy what's left of her. I told her that's exactly what he wants, for her to give up. But she won't listen. She's convinced that silence is survival. The entries continued through July, growing more desperate. Eva's talking about leaving. She won't say where she's going, but I can see it in her eyes. She's planning to disappear. I've tried everything I can think of to convince her to stay, to finish the album, to not let Drummond win. But she's made up her mind. She thinks running will save her. I think it'll destroy her. The final entry from 1983 was dated July 28th. Eva left last night. No goodbye, just a note saying she needed to start over somewhere no one knew her. Johnny is heartbroken. So am I. But I understand. She's not strong enough yet to fight. Maybe she'll never be. So I'll do what I can. I'll keep the tapes safe. I'll preserve the evidence. And I'll wait. If she ever wants to come back to herself, it'll all be here. Eva closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. Lorraine had understood, had known that Eva needed time, needed space, needed to heal on her own terms. But her sister had also kept the door open, had made sure there was a way back if Eva ever found the courage to take it. It had taken 40 years and Lorraine's death, but Eva was finally walking through that door. She pulled out her phone again and scrolled through her contacts until she found what she was looking for, a number she'd saved years ago but never called. It belonged to a reporter at a Nashville newspaper, someone who'd tried to interview her once about her brief musical career. Eva had refused then, too frightened of dredging up the past. But now she had a story to tell. Not just about herself, but about all the women Drummond had hurt. About a pattern of abuse that had continued for 4 decades because people like her had been too afraid to speak. She couldn't get a signal in the cabin, so she drove down the mountain until her phone showed bars. Then she pulled over and made the call. The reporter's voicemail picked up. Eva left a message. My name is Eva Rook. I was assaulted by Marcus Drummond in 1983. I filed a police report but withdrew it due to legal pressure. I have documentation of what happened to me, and I have reason to believe there are other women with similar stories. I'm ready to talk. Call me back. She ended the call and sat in her truck, heart pounding. She'd done it. After 40 years of silence, she'd finally spoken. Now she just had to wait to see what would happen next. The reporter called back within 2 hours. Her name was Andrea Chen, and she'd been covering music industry issues for 15 years. She'd written extensively about abuse and harassment in Nashville, about the systems that protected powerful men and silenced victims. "I remember trying to reach you years ago," Andrea said. "You were impossible to find. I'm glad you called." "I wasn't ready then," Eva replied. "I am now." They arranged to meet at the cabin the following day. In the meantime, Andrea asked Eva to gather any documentation she had. Eva assured her there was plenty. After the call, Eva drove into the nearest town, a small place called Ridgemont, about 20 minutes, down winding mountain roads. She needed supplies, and she needed to start rebuilding connections with the world she'd been hiding from. The town was typical Appalachian, a main street with locally owned shops, churches on every other corner, people who nodded hello as she passed. She found a hardware store and bought materials for basic repairs. Then she stopped at a small diner for lunch. That's where she met Faye. The young woman was working behind the counter, maybe 30 years old, with bright eyes and an easy smile. When Eva ordered coffee and a sandwich, Faye studied her for a moment. "You're staying up at the old Shaw place, aren't you? Vernon's been talking about you." Eva nodded. "I'm fixing it up." "That's good. It's a beautiful property. Been abandoned too long." Faye poured the coffee. "Vernon mentioned you're a musician. Or were. A long time ago. My grandmother loved country music. She actually met Johnny Cash once, back in the 80s. Said he was the kindest man she ever met." Eva's hand tightened on her coffee cup. "Where did she meet him?" "Here in Ridgemont. He came through town a few times, always real quiet, didn't want attention. Stayed up at that cabin you're in now, actually. My grandmother ran a boarding house back then, and some of the musicians who worked with him would stay there." Faye leaned closer, her voice dropping. "She said he was helping some young singer who'd been hurt. Said he brought her here to heal and make music. Your grandmother sounds like a perceptive woman. She passed a few years ago, but she kept journals. Every interesting thing that happened in this town, she wrote it down." Faye studied Eva more carefully. "Were you that singer?" Eva hesitated, then nodded. "I was. I thought maybe." Faye's expression was kind, not judgmental. "Vernon mentioned you had some old tapes. If you need help digitizing them, I know someone. I work at an audio restoration shop on weekends. We specialize in preserving old recordings." Eva felt something shift inside her, a door opening that she'd kept locked for decades. "I might take you up on that." "Good. Because if Johnny Cash thought your music was worth preserving, it definitely is." When Eva returned to the cabin, Vernon's truck was there. He and a younger man were measuring the porch. "This is my grandson, Dean," Vernon said. "He took a look at what needs fixing. It's not as bad as it could be." Dean was in his 40s, with kind eyes and rough hands. He showed Eva his estimate, reasonable prices, quality work. She agreed to let him start the following week. "Place has good bones," Dean said, examining the log walls. "Someone built this to last. Just needs some love and attention." After they left, Eva returned to the tapes. She was running out of recordings from 1983, approaching the end of that summer when she'd fled. But there were still a few she hadn't heard. She loaded a tape dated July 25th, 1983, 3 days before she'd left. It opened with just guitar and voice. Her voice, singing a song she'd titled, "When I'm Ready." The lyrics were about healing at your own pace, about refusing to be rushed or pushed before you're prepared, about honoring your own timeline, even when others want you to move faster. It was beautiful and sad, and honest in a way that made Eva's throat tight. When the song ended, There was conversation on the tape. "That one's special," Cash said. "Real special. It's about leaving." Her younger self's voice was quiet. "I know. I can't stay, John. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. You have to do what you need to do. But you've done so much for me. You and Lorraine. And I'm just going to waste it all by running away." "You're not wasting anything. These recordings exist. These songs exist. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, they'll still be here." "What if I'm never ready?" "Then you're never ready. That's okay too. Your healing is more important than any album." A long pause. Then her voice again, smaller. "Do you think I'm a coward?" "No. I think you're someone who's been through hell and is trying to survive it, the only way you know how. There's no shame in that. Lorraine thinks I'm making a mistake. Lorraine loves you. She doesn't want to lose you, but she'll understand eventually. We both will." The tape ended there. Eva sat in the growing darkness, thinking about Cash's kindness, about his willingness to let her go, even though it meant the album would never be finished. He'd put her well-being above the music. How many people in Nashville would have done that? The next morning, Andrea Chen arrived. She was in her mid-40s, professional and warm, carrying a leather bag full of recording equipment. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Andrea said, as Eva led her inside. "And thank you for trusting me with this. I'm not sure trust is the right word, but I'm ready to tell the truth. Finally." They sat at the old kitchen table. Andrea set up her recorder and pulled out a notepad. Then she looked at Eva with steady, compassionate eyes. "Why don't you start at the beginning?" So Eva told her story, all of it. Growing up in Virginia, coming to Nashville at 21 with a guitar and dreams. The early gigs, the attention from producers, the contract with RCA. Meeting Marcus Drummond, who promised to make her a star. Then the night at the Grand Ole Opry, her performance, the dressing room afterward. Drummond's hands on her, his voice in her ear telling her this was how the business worked. Her body freezing, unable to fight or scream. Lorraine and the security guard interrupting. The hospital, the police report, the lawyer's threats, her decision to withdraw everything and disappear. Andrea listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, but mostly just being present. When Eva finished the main narrative, Andrea asked careful questions about dates, about witnesses, about the documentation Eva had saved. Eva showed her everything. The police report, the photographs, Lorraine's journal, the newspaper clippings about other women, Cash's letters. Andrea studied each document carefully. "This is incredibly thorough. Your sister did remarkable work preserving all this. She knew I'd need it someday, even if I didn't know it myself. Eva, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you prepared for what might happen if we publish this? Drummond will deny everything. His lawyers will attack your credibility. The industry might close ranks around him. It won't be easy, I know, but I've spent 40 years being silent. Look what that got me." Eva gestured at the documents. "He kept doing it. He hurt other women. Maybe if I'd been braver back then." "Don't do that," Andrea said firmly. "Don't blame yourself for his choices. You were traumatized. You did what you needed to survive. That's not the same as enabling him. But if I speak now, maybe he finally faces consequences. Maybe. Or maybe he uses his power to bury this too. I need you to be prepared for both possibilities." "I am. And even if nothing happens to him, at least other women will know they're not alone. At least my sister's work won't be wasted." Andrea nodded slowly. "All right. Then let's do this. Let's tell your story. They spent the next 4 hours going through everything in detail. Andrea asked about the music, about Cash's involvement, about the album that was never released. She was particularly interested in the recordings themselves. "Would you be willing to let me hear them?" Andrea asked. "If we're going to tell the full story, about what you lost, about what Drummond stole from you, people need to understand how talented you were." Eva hesitated, then agreed. She loaded one of the tapes and pressed play. Her voice filled the cabin, young and powerful and full of promise. Andrea listened with her eyes closed. When the song ended, she opened them with tears on her cheeks. "Eva, that's extraordinary. That's not just good. That's genuinely great. It was a long time ago. Have you tried singing since then?" "Not until a few days ago. I've been playing guitar a little, working through some of the old songs." "And how does it feel?" Eva considered the question. "Like coming home. Like finding a part of myself I thought was dead." Andrea smiled. "That's a good line. Can I use it?" "Use whatever you need." Before Andrea left, she explained her timeline. She'd need a week to do additional research, to reach out to other potential victims, to verify facts, and build the most complete picture possible. "I'll send you a draft before publication," Andrea promised. "You'll have full approval over anything we use. This is your story. You control how it's told." After Andrea drove away, Eva felt both exhausted and strangely energized. She'd done it. She'd finally told someone official what happened, and Andrea believed her. More than that, Andrea thought the story mattered enough to investigate further. That evening, Eva accepted Vernon's dinner invitation. She drove to his house, a tidy ranch at the base of the mountain, and met his wife, Patricia. The woman greeted her with a hug, as if they were old friends. "Vernon's told me so much about you," Patricia said, "and I'm so glad you're staying at the cabin. It deserves someone who appreciates it." Over pot roast and potatoes, Eva found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. Vernon and Patricia asked questions, but didn't pry. They shared stories about the town, about their grandchildren, about the quiet rhythms of mountain life. "You know," Patricia said over dessert, "my mother used to talk about a singer who stayed at the cabin. This would have been back in 83, 84. She said the girl had the voice of an angel, but looked like someone who'd been through war." Eva set down her fork. "Your mother was Faye's grandmother?" "That's right. Small world up here in the mountains. Everyone's connected somehow." Patricia smiled gently. She always wondered what happened to that girl. Hoped she found peace eventually. "I'm working on it," Eva said quietly. After dinner, Eva drove back up the mountain with a container of leftovers and a warmth in her chest she barely recognized. Connection, community, the things she'd denied herself for 4 decades out of fear and shame. Back at the cabin, she sat on the porch with her guitar and played through the old songs. Her voice was rusty, but growing stronger each time she used it. She sang "Mountain Girl" and "No More Running," sang them into the Tennessee night, as if she could send them back through time to the woman she used to be. When she finally went inside, she found one last tape she hadn't heard. It was labeled simply, "Forever, Final Session." She loaded it onto the player, expecting another song. Instead, she heard Johnny Cash's voice, alone, speaking directly to her. "Eva, if you're listening to this, it means you came back. I hoped you would, even though I understood why you had to leave. I want you to know something. The work we did here, the songs you wrote, the music you made, it matters. It'll always matter, whether the world ever hears it or not." You've got a voice that can heal people, including yourself. Don't forget that. And don't let anyone convince you that you're less than extraordinary because of what was done to you. You're a survivor. That makes you stronger, not weaker. I hope by the time you hear this, you've found peace. I hope you've found a way to live with what happened without letting it define you. And I hope you're singing again. Because the world needs voices like yours. Voices that tell the truth, that speak for people who can't speak for themselves. Be well, Ever Rook. Be brave. And know that you are cared for, even if we never meet again. The tape ended. Ever sat in the silence, tears streaming down her face. Johnny Cash had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, had preserved her music, her story, her voice, had given her a path back to herself when she was finally ready to take it. She was ready now. After 40 years, she was finally ready. Andrea's article went live on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after their initial meeting. Ever woke to find her phone. She'd started driving down the mountain each morning for signal, flooded with notifications. The headline read, "The Voice That Was Silenced: How Music Producer Marcus Drummond's Abuse Spanned 4 Decades." Ever sat in her truck on the side of the mountain road and read the article on her phone screen. Andrea had done remarkable work. The piece opened with Ever's story, the assault, the police report, the legal threats that forced her into silence. But it didn't stop there. Andrea had found them, the other women. Jennifer Hobbs from 1995 agreed to speak on record. So did Amanda Pierce from 2009. 3 others agreed to be quoted anonymously. Each woman described the same pattern. Drummond using his power to coerce, to assault, to destroy careers when women refused him or spoke out. The article included photographs of Ever from 1983, young and hopeful, next to images of the police report and the threatening letter from Drummond's attorney. It included quotes from Vernon about Johnny Cash's involvement, about the recording sessions meant to help Ever heal. And it included audio clips. Ever clicked on the embedded player with shaking hands. Her own voice poured out, singing "Mountain Girl." The recording was 40 years old, but crystal clear, thanks to Faye's restoration work. The article ended with a statement from Drummond's current lawyer, denying all allegations and threatening legal action. But even that denial felt hollow next to the weight of evidence Andrea had assembled. Ever's phone rang. It was Andrea. "Have you seen it?" the reporter asked. "I'm reading it now." The response has been overwhelming. The story's been shared thousands of times already. And Ever, 3 more women have contacted me this morning. Women who say Drummond assaulted them but never reported it. Ever closed her eyes. 3 more. How many others were there? How many lives had he destroyed? "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait." The Nashville police have already issued a statement saying they're reviewing the case. The district attorney's office is looking at whether they can bring charges despite the age of the incidents. And several of Drummond's current clients have dropped him. Do you think he'll actually face consequences? I don't know. But for the first time in 4 decades, there's a real chance. Andrea paused. "How are you doing?" "I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. I feel," Ever searched for the right word, "free. Like I've been carrying a weight for 40 years and finally set it down." After the call, Ever drove to town. She needed to see people, to be around community, to remind herself she wasn't alone anymore. At the diner, Faye greeted her with a hug. "I read the article," Faye said quietly. "I'm so sorry that happened to you, and I'm so proud of you for speaking out." Other people in the diner nodded to Ever with respect. Vernon was there with Dean, and they made room for her at their table. "You did a brave thing," Vernon said simply. The afternoon brought more attention. Reporters called, requesting interviews. Music industry veterans reached out with messages of support. Some were people ever remembered from Nashville, musicians who'd worked with her, songwriters who'd believed in her talent. Others were younger artists who'd grown up hearing whispers about Drummond but never had proof. And then, late in the afternoon, something unexpected happened. A major streaming platform reached out through Andrea, requesting permission to release Eva's recordings from 1982-1983. Eva sat on the porch, holding her phone, staring at the email Andrea had forwarded. They wanted to release her album, the one she'd never finished, the one that had sat in a trunk for 40 years. They wanted to put it out into the world. "They're offering a very fair deal," Andrea had written. "All proceeds would go to you. And they're suggesting that any profits beyond production costs go to organizations supporting sexual assault survivors. It's your choice, Eva. But I think Johnny Cash would have wanted this music heard." Eva looked out at the mountains, at the forest turning brilliant with autumn color. She thought about Lorraine, about all the years her sister had spent protecting these recordings. She thought about Cash, about his belief that her voice could heal people. She called Andrea back. "Tell them yes. Let's release it." The next few days were a whirlwind. Eva worked with Faye to finish digitizing and restoring all the tapes. The streaming platform's team was professional and respectful, working remotely but checking in regularly. They wanted to release the album within 2 weeks, while the story was still fresh in the public consciousness. They decided to title it Eva's Voice, with liner notes explaining the full story. Cash's duet with her would be the lead single. Meanwhile, the legal situation around Drummond continued to develop. The Nashville police opened a formal investigation. More women came forward, not just those mentioned in Andrea's article, but others who'd been waiting years for someone to break the silence. On Friday, a week after the article published, Drummond was arrested on multiple counts of sexual assault. His lawyers posted bail within hours, but the damage to his reputation was done. His remaining clients dropped him. The labels he worked with issued statements distancing themselves. His production company announced he was taking a leave of absence. Eva watched the news coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice, yes, but 40 years too late. If she'd been brave enough to testify in 1983, how many women could have been spared? "Stop doing that," Faye said. She'd become a regular visitor at the cabin, helping with restoration work and keeping Eva company. "Stop blaming yourself for his choices." "I can't help it." "Yes, you can. You were 22 and traumatized. You made the only choice you could make at the time. The fact that you're speaking now, that's what matters." Dean and his crew had started work on the cabin, repairing the porch and the roof, replacing rotted boards. The sound of hammering and sawing filled the days, a reminder that things broken could be fixed, that it was never too late to rebuild. Vernon stopped by most afternoons, ostensibly to check on Dean's work, but really just to sit with Eva and talk. He shared stories about the town, about his own life, about the quiet contentment of growing old in the mountains. "You're becoming part of the community," he said one evening, as they sat on the newly repaired porch. "People are starting to see you as one of us." "I haven't been part of a community in 40 years. "Well, you are now, whether you like it or not." Eva smiled. She did like it, more than she'd expected to. The album was set to release on a Friday. The streaming platform planned a small promotional campaign, nothing excessive, just enough to let people know the story behind the music. Andrea was writing a follow-up article about the album's release and what it meant for survivors of industry abuse. 2 days before the release, Eva received an unexpected package. It was delivered by a courier service, forwarded from Andrea's office. Inside was a letter and a small box. The letter was from June Carter Cash, Johnny Cash's widow. "Dear Eva," it read. "John spoke of you often over the years. He always wondered where you'd gone, whether you were safe, whether you'd found peace. He would be so proud of your courage in speaking out, and he would be thrilled that your music is finally being heard. I've enclosed something I thought you should have. John kept it in his office until he died. I think he was hoping to give it to you himself someday." Inside the small box was a photograph, Johnny Cash and Eva, standing together in this very cabin. She was holding her guitar, and he had his arm around her shoulders, protective, paternal. Both of them were smiling. On the back, in Cash's handwriting, "Eva Rook, April 1983. A voice that will change the world." Eva held the photograph and wept, for everything she'd lost, for everything she'd found again, for the man who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. That night, she called Andrea. "I want to do more interviews, as many as will help. I want to talk about what happened, about the pattern of abuse, about why it took 40 years to speak. I want to make sure other women know they're not alone. Are you sure? The attention can be overwhelming." "I'm sure. This isn't just about me anymore. It's bigger than that." The next morning brought more news. The district attorney's office announced they were pursuing charges against Drummond based on the statements from multiple victims. It was rare for cases this old to move forward, but the pattern of behavior and the weight of evidence made prosecution viable. Eva drove down the mountain to a hotel in a larger town 30 minutes away. A major news network had requested an interview, and Andrea had helped set it up. The interviewer was professional and empathetic, asking hard questions, but never making Eva feel exploited. "What do you want people to understand about what happened to you?" the interviewer asked. Eva thought carefully before answering. "That silence doesn't protect us. It only protects the people who hurt us. I stayed silent for 40 years because I was afraid. Afraid no one would believe me. Afraid of destroying what was left of my life. Afraid of reliving the trauma. But that silence enabled Marcus Drummond to hurt other women. And I have to live with that." Do you think the industry has changed since 1983? Yes and no. There's more awareness now, more willingness to believe survivors. But power still protects power. Men like Drummond still get away with abuse for decades because they're valuable to the people at the top. Until that changes, until we value human dignity over profit, this will keep happening. The interview aired that evening. Eva watched it in the cabin, surrounded by Vernon, Patricia, Faye, and Dean. When it ended, they sat in silence for a moment. Then Faye said, "You're going to help a lot of people." "I hope so. That's all I want now, for something good to come from all this pain." The album dropped at midnight on Friday. Eva was awake, sitting on the porch with her laptop, watching the numbers climb. Within an hour, Eva's voice was trending. Within 3 hours, it had climbed into the top 10 on multiple charts. But it was the comments that broke her. Thousands of people sharing their own stories of survival, of silence, of finally finding their voice. Musicians who'd been in Nashville during the 80s, confirming that everyone had known about Drummond, but no one had stopped him. Younger artists expressing gratitude that someone was finally speaking truth about the industry's darkest secrets. And the reviews. Critics were unanimous. This wasn't just historically significant, it was genuinely great music. Eva's voice was compared to Emmylou Harris, to Dolly Parton, to the best of classic country. The songs themselves were praised for their honesty, their craft, their emotional depth. "This is what we lost when Marcus Drummond assaulted Eva Rook," one reviewer wrote. Not just one woman's career, but a voice that could have defined a generation. The duet with Johnny Cash became an instant classic. Music historians noted that it was one of Cash's last collaborations before his health declined, a final gift to a young artist he'd tried to save. By morning, Eva's voice had sold over 100,000 downloads. The streaming numbers were even higher. Eva's story was everywhere: news programs, podcasts, social media. She'd become, overnight, a symbol of survival and delayed justice. Andrea called early Saturday morning. Drummond's label just dropped him completely, and 3 more women have filed police reports this week, emboldened by your story. The prosecutor thinks they have enough for a strong case. Will I have to testify? Probably. If it goes to trial, are you ready for that? Eva looked out at the mountains, at the cabin that had become her sanctuary again. Yes, I'm ready. The weekend brought more attention. Eva did interviews with major publications, always redirecting the focus from herself to the broader pattern of industry abuse. She talked about the women who'd come forward, about the systems that protected predators, about the need for real change. Vernon's house became her refuge between interviews. Patricia cooked. Faye helped manage the logistics. Dean kept working on the cabin repairs as if nothing had changed. They formed a buffer between Eva and the overwhelming attention, keeping her grounded in reality. On Monday, something unexpected happened. A young woman showed up at the cabin, having driven up from Nashville. Her name was Riley. She was 24, and she'd been assaulted by Drummond 6 months ago. "I heard your music," Riley said, tears streaming down her face. "I heard your story, and I realized I didn't have to stay silent anymore." Eva invited her inside, made tea, listened. Riley had been an aspiring songwriter, taken in by Drummond's promises. He'd assaulted her in his office, then blackballed her when she tried to speak out. She'd been about to give up on music entirely when Eva's story broke. "You saved me," Riley said. "You showed me it wasn't my fault, that I could fight back." "Have you filed a police report?" "I did. Yesterday. I'm the 4th woman this week." Eva hugged her. 2 survivors separated by 4 decades, but connected by the same trauma and the same courage. "You're braver than I was. You're not waiting 40 years. Only because you showed me it was possible." After Riley left, Eva sat on the porch and cried. She'd spent weeks thinking about what her silence had cost, but now she could see what her speaking might give: courage to others, a path forward, proof that survival was possible. The legal case moved forward rapidly. The prosecutor's office, emboldened by public support and the weight of evidence, pursued charges aggressively. Drummond's lawyers tried every tactic, claiming the cases were too old, arguing that the accusers were motivated by Eva's fame, suggesting that consensual encounters were being reframed as assault. But the pattern was too clear, the evidence too strong. 7 women with nearly identical stories, spanning 40 years. Medical records, police reports, threatening letters from Drummond's lawyers. It was damning. In late October, 3 weeks after Eva's story broke, Marcus Drummond's legal team reached out with a settlement offer. If the women would agree not to testify, Drummond would plead to reduced charges and accept a 5-year sentence. Eva called a meeting with Andrea and several of the other women who'd come forward. They gathered at a lawyer's office in Nashville, the first time Eva had been back to the city in 40 years. "What do you think?" Jennifer Hobbs asked. "Is 5 years enough?" No, Eva said. It's not enough for what he did. But it's more than we thought we'd get. I want to testify, Riley said. I want to make him look at me while I describe what he did. I understand that impulse, Eva replied. But trials are brutal. His lawyers will tear us apart. They'll question every detail, suggest we're lying, make us relive the trauma over and over. And at the end, he might walk away completely free. They debated for hours. In the end, they agreed to take the deal. 5 years was inadequate, but it was certain. And Drummond would be a registered sex offender for life, his reputation destroyed, his career over. The day Drummond entered his plea, Eva stood outside the courthouse with the other women. Cameras surrounded them, reporters shouting questions. Eva spoke for the group, her voice steady and strong. This isn't the justice we deserved, but it's more justice than most survivors ever get. Marcus Drummond will go to prison. He'll be held accountable for his crimes. And most importantly, he'll never hurt another woman in this industry again. Someone asked if she'd sing again, if she'd tour to support the album. Eva smiled. I'm not sure about touring, but I'm singing again. Yes, for the first time in 40 years, I'm making music. Not because I have to, not because anyone's forcing me, but because I want to. Because music is mine again. He doesn't get to take that from me anymore. That night, Eva drove back to the cabin. The place was fully repaired now, sturdy and warm and beautiful. Dean had finished the last of the work that afternoon, and the property looked cared for in a way it hadn't in decades. She sat on the porch with her guitar and called Andrea. I want to do something with the money from the album. Okay. What? I want to turn this cabin into a retreat, a place where survivors can come to heal and make art, music, writing, whatever they need. I want it to be what it was for me in 1983, a sanctuary. That's a beautiful idea. Johnny Cash gave this place to me when I needed it most. Lorraine preserved it, so I could come back to myself. Now I want to give it to other people who need the same thing. Over the next few weeks, Eva worked with Andrea and a team of advisors to establish a non-profit. They'd run residential programs for survivors, offering space and resources to process trauma through creative work. The cabin would become the first site, with plans to add more locations if funding allowed. Vernon agreed to help manage the property. Faye signed on to run the music program. Dean offered to donate his time for any future renovations. Patricia volunteered to cook for residents. You've built something real here, Vernon said when they finalized the plans. Not just a building, a community, a purpose. That's what Lorraine wanted. That's what Cash believed in. I'm just finally living up to what they saw in me. The album continued to climb charts throughout November. Eva's Voice became one of the year's biggest surprise successes, a 40-year-old recording that spoke to contemporary audiences about trauma, survival, and reclamation. Music critics wrote think pieces about what the industry had lost when it silenced Eva, about how many other voices had been stolen by men like Drummond, and people kept reaching out. Survivors sharing their stories, musicians offering support, journalists requesting interviews. Eva said yes to as many as she could handle, always with the same message. Speak up. Speak out. Don't let fear silence you forever. In early December, Eva received an invitation to perform at a benefit concert in Nashville. The event would raise money for organizations supporting survivors of sexual assault. Other major artists had agreed to participate, all of them wanting to show solidarity. Eva hesitated. Performing live terrified her. She hadn't stood on a stage in 40 years. But Faye encouraged her. You've already done the hardest part. You've already told the truth. Singing is the easy part. So Eva agreed. She'd perform 2 songs, Mountain Girl and the duet with Johnny Cash. For the duet, they'd use a backing track of Cash's vocals, allowing Eva to sing alongside the recording. The night of the concert, Eva stood backstage at the Ryman Auditorium, not the Grand Ole Opry where she'd been assaulted, but close enough to feel triggering. Her hands shook, her chest felt tight. Then she thought about Riley, about Jennifer, about all the women who'd found courage to speak because she'd gone first. She thought about Lorraine and Johnny Cash, and everyone who'd believed in her voice when she couldn't believe in herself. She walked on stage to thunderous applause. The lights were bright, but not blinding. The crowd was enormous, but supportive. She took a breath and began to play. Her voice cracked on the first line of Mountain Girl, but it held on the second. By the chorus, she was singing with the strength and power of her younger self, 40 years of pain and survival pouring through the music. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet. Eva stood at the microphone, tears streaming down her face, feeling something she hadn't felt since 1983, like she belonged on a stage, like her voice mattered. Then the backing track started, Johnny Cash's unmistakable voice filling the venue. Eva joined him on the duet, their voices blending across time and death and all the years between. It was transcendent and healing, and exactly what Cash had believed music could be. When it ended, Eva looked out at thousands of faces and said simply, "Thank you for listening, for believing, for not letting them silence us anymore." She walked off stage to deafening applause, directly into Faye's embrace. "You did it," Faye whispered. "You really did it." Eva smiled through her tears. "No, we did it. All of us together." 3 months after the benefit concert, Eva stood on the cabin's porch in early March sunlight, watching the first group of residents arrive. There were 6 women, ranging from early 20s to mid-50s, all survivors of various forms of trauma. They'd applied for the 2-week residency program, and all had been accepted. The cabin could house 4 residents comfortably, so Eva had worked with Dean to renovate the old shed into additional sleeping quarters. The property now offered quiet spaces for individual work, a shared studio for collaboration, and common areas for gathering. Faye had assembled an impressive collection of instruments and recording equipment. Vernon's wife, Patricia, had stocked the kitchen with enough food for an army. Eva greeted each woman as she arrived, remembering her own arrival at this place, broken, desperate, barely holding on. She saw that same brokenness in their eyes, that same desperate hope that maybe, possibly, this might be the place where healing became possible. "Welcome," she said to each of them. "You're safe here. You're believed here. And whatever you need to create, we'll support you." That evening, they gathered around a fire pit Dean had built in the clearing. Eva shared her own story, not the public version from interviews, but the intimate one. The fear, the shame, the 40 years of running. The moment she'd opened the trunk and started remembering. The slow, painful process of reclaiming her voice. "I'm not going to lie to you," she said, as the fire crackled between them. "Healing isn't linear. Some days you'll feel strong. Other days the trauma will hit you like it just happened yesterday. Both are normal. Both are okay." One of the younger women, Sarah, who'd been assaulted by a college professor, asked, "Do you think you'll ever fully heal? Or is this just something we carry forever?" Eva considered the question carefully. "I don't know if fully healed is a real thing. The trauma happened. It's part of my history now. But what I've learned is that I can build a life around it. I can make it smaller by making everything else bigger. My connections, my purpose, my joy. The trauma doesn't disappear. But it doesn't have to be the whole story anymore. Over the next 2 weeks, Eva watched the women transform. They wrote songs, composed poetry, created visual art. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and strategies for survival. They cried together and laughed together, and slowly, tentatively, began to trust again. Faye led music sessions, helping those who wanted to work on songwriting or performance. Vernon shared wisdom from his 70-plus years, offering a grandfather's perspective. Patricia cooked meals that felt like love made tangible. On the final night of the residency, they held a small concert around the fire pit. Each woman performed something she'd created during her stay. Some sang, others read poetry. One performed a dramatic monologue. Eva sat and listened, her heart full. When it was her turn, she sang a new song she'd written that winter, about mountain women who survive everything thrown at them, who rebuild after destruction, who refuse to be silenced. The women joined her on the chorus, their voices blending in harmony. After the women left, Eva walked through the quiet cabin. She touched the mantel where Johnny Cash's photograph sat, ran her hand along the railing Dean had rebuilt, stood in the doorway of the small room where she'd found the trunk that changed everything. She thought about Lorraine, about her sister's faith that someday Eva would be ready, about the 15 years Lorraine had maintained this place, keeping it safe, keeping the truth preserved. Eva wished her sister could see what the cabin had become. Not a mausoleum for lost dreams, but a living space of transformation. She walked to the small cemetery in town where Lorraine was buried. She hadn't visited yet, hadn't been ready. But now she knelt beside her sister's grave and finally said the things she'd needed to say. You were right, about all of it. I needed to face what happened. I needed to stop running. I'm sorry it took me so long to listen. She placed a hand on the cool stone. I'm using the cabin the way you hoped I would. I'm helping people the way Cash helped me. And I'm singing again, Lorraine. After 40 years, I'm singing. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of early spring. Eva sat with her sister for a long time, feeling something like peace settle over her. That evening, Andrea called with news. The prosecutor's office just announced that 2 more men in the music industry are under investigation for sexual assault. Multiple women have come forward, inspired by your case. They're calling it the Eva effect. Eva smiled sadly. I wish it didn't take one person speaking for others to feel safe doing it. I know. But you started something real. The industry's changing because you had the courage to speak. Not just me. All the women who came forward. All the people who believed us. That's what created change. Her album continued to sell steadily. Eva's voice had become a cultural touchstone, studied in university classes about music history and trauma recovery. The duet with Johnny Cash was nominated for multiple posthumous awards, recognition of what the industry had lost when it silenced Eva. But more meaningful to Eva were the messages from survivors. They came daily, emails, letters, social media posts, people sharing how her story had given them courage to leave abusive relationships, to report assaults, to reclaim their own voices. Some sent their own music, their own art, asking for feedback. Eva tried to respond to as many as she could, offering encouragement and connection. She understood viscerally how important it was to know you weren't alone, that survival was possible, that silence didn't have to be permanent. In late spring, Vernon's grandson, Dean, asked if Eva would sing at his wedding. She agreed, honored. Standing in a small mountain church, surrounded by community that had embraced her, she sang a song about love that endures, about building something strong together, about the courage it takes to trust after you've been hurt. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Patricia hugged her afterward, whispering, "Your voice is a gift. Thank you for sharing it again." Summer brought another group of residents to the cabin. This time there were 8 women, and Eva had hired additional staff to support them. Faye worked full-time now, along with a trauma counselor and a visual arts instructor. The non-profit was growing, expanding its reach. Eva spent her mornings working on new music. She'd written an album's worth of songs over the winter. Not about the assault, not about Drummond, but about healing and reclamation, and the particular strength of women who survive. She planned to record them at the cabin, full circle to where she'd made music with Johnny Cash 40 years ago. One afternoon in July, a young journalist arrived for an interview. She was working on a retrospective about Eva's impact on the music industry and on survivor advocacy. They sat on the porch, and she asked Eva to reflect on the past year. "A year ago, I was living alone in Virginia, hadn't sung in decades, hadn't told anyone my real story. Now," Eva gestured at the cabin, at the mountains beyond. "Now I have purpose, community, my voice back. It's almost overwhelming how much has changed. Do you have regrets about the 40 years in between?" Eva thought carefully. "Yes and no. I regret that my silence enabled Drummond to hurt others. I wish I'd been brave enough to speak sooner. But I also understand that I wasn't ready. The woman I was at 22 couldn't have done this. She was too broken, too frightened. I needed those 40 years to become someone strong enough to face it. What advice would you give to survivors who are where you were? That there's no right timeline. Some people speak immediately. Others need decades. Both are valid. And that healing isn't linear. It's messy and complicated and full of setbacks. But it's possible. If I can reclaim my voice after 40 years of silence, anyone can." As summer turned to fall, Eva stood on the porch one evening with her guitar, watching the sunset over the mountains. The cabin was quiet. The current residents had gone into town for dinner, and she had the place to herself. She thought about the photograph in her wallet, the backstage pass from 1983. She'd carried it for 40 years, a reminder of who she used to be and what had been stolen from her. But she didn't need it anymore. She knew who she was now. Not the young girl who'd been assaulted, not the broken woman who'd run away, but someone who'd survived and transformed and found purpose in the surviving. She pulled out the pass and looked at it one last time. Then she walked to the fire pit, struck a match, and watched it burn. The flames consumed the laminated plastic, releasing 4 decades of shame and silence and fear. When it was gone, she picked up her guitar and sang. Not for an audience, not for a recording, just for herself and the mountains, and the memory of everyone who'd believed in her voice when she couldn't believe in it herself. She sang Mountain Girl and No More Running. She sang the duet with Johnny Cash, his part carried on the wind and in her memory. She sang her new songs about survival and strength, and the particular courage it takes to live fully after trauma tries to break you. And as she sang, she understood something fundamental. Marcus Drummond had stolen years of her life, had silenced her voice for decades. But he hadn't won. Because she was here now, singing into the Tennessee night, helping other women find their voices, building something real and meaningful from the ruins of what might have been. This was her legacy now. Not the career that was stolen, but the community she'd built. Not the albums that were never made, but the healing space she'd created. Not the silence that had defined her, but the voice that had returned, stronger and more certain than before. Rook had bought a forgotten cabin for $10 and found everything she'd been running from. But more than that, she'd found everything she'd needed to finally come home to herself. And in doing so, she'd shown countless others the way home too.